Hi, and welcome to the DIY Photo Organising podcast, focusing on topics to help you with your photo management. I'm Fiona from Photo Helper.
And I'm Chantal from Photos in Order. Hello there.
Hi.
Today, we would like to talk about a topic that we've not really touched on so often, and that is genealogy.
Mm.
And we want to talk about what is it in the first place, and how our photos, of course, are part of it, and what could be challenges and what could be solutions, even more importantly. So, uh, neither of us really is an expert in that. So, we have asked one to join us today.
Yay!
Please welcome Caroline Guntur from the Swedish Organizer.
Welcome, Caroline. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to be here.
Wonderful.
We're really happy that you could join us today. Caroline is in Chicago. So, welcome to our little Australian podcast.
Thank you.
So, obviously, given your business name, the Swedish Organizer, you must be Swedish.
I am. I am. I was born and raised there, and I have dual citizenship. I just came to the US for college, and it was meant to be a 1 year study abroad thing, and here I am, 20 years later.
There you go.
20 years. Wow, that's
Awesome.
fantastic. So let's jump in, Caroline. Could you start us off? That's a tiny little snippet. Could you just tell us a little bit about yourself and just maybe how you started into this beautiful world of photo organising?
Absolutely.
Wonderful.
It was an evolution, and I think most people in this industry will probably tell you that, right? So I've always been interested in photography and family history and stories. I've always been very creative ever since I was a little girl, and during college and grad school, I did a lot of photography. I actually worked briefly as a photographer. But after that, I decided to take a break and raise a family. And so when I was ready to go back to work, I kept looking for jobs that would sort of fit my interest and my skills. And I wasn't really finding anything that was a perfect match. I bounced around for quite a lot between virtual assistants and web design and photography, and it was always great, but not perfect. And I really wanted to find, I don't, like a better use for my talents because I knew that there was something there. But of course, organizing wasn't really a thing yet. Digital photos were sort of just starting to happen. The revolution was just sort of in its infancy at that time. And so I finally settled on just organizing. And I started my own company, being the Swedish Organizer. And I was doing all types of organizing at that time. So closets, kitchens, digital work, productivity, more like a generalist type of approach. And at that time, of course, I was keeping in with my hobbies, right? Photography, family history, and just for myself. And then one piece at a time, it sort of fell into place that, hey, maybe I should be organizing photos and this family history that I love and all of those things. There must be a market out there. And sure enough, that's sort of around the time that Apple was born as well. And so I joined Apple, and the rest is history. It just was the perfect fit for me.
Wow.
Awesome. So you're one
Yeah.
of the really early adapters.
Um,
You must
well,
be
I
one of
didn't
the
join
first
right
members.
away,
Oh, okay.
but it was pretty early on. It was
Mm.
pretty early on. Yeah,
Wow, cool.
yeah.
So you mentioned, you've got a big interest in family history.
Mm-hmm.
So we know that you're very invested in that and interested, and not just personally, but also professionally. So
Mm-hmm.
can you tell us a little bit more about that and maybe how it started, and how it
Definitely.
became a passion of yours?
Yeah, definitely. That was a passion that started really early as well.
Mm.
Actually, what happened was, I remember the specific day actually, which is
Wow.
unusual. Yeah. So I was actually a teenager in high school, and this was back in Sweden. And my teacher one day walked in and said, "This semester we're going to do something fun," which I'm doing for myself, but I think you'll really benefit from it as well as young adults, you know?
Mm.
We're going to do a family history project because to know where you're going in the future, you need to know where you've been. And I remember him saying that very clearly. We're going to research this, and then we're all going to present to each other what we found, and in front of the class. And I was just so excited because
Mhm.
I'd always been very curious about that naturally. I'm an only child. I never really got to know my grandparents. They passed when I was young. And so it was really just my mom, my dad, and me, the three musketeers. And so I always kind of wondered what it would be like to have a large family. I always wondered about my family history. And so I was really excited about this project. And I went home and I asked my mom, what do we know? And I think the answer she gave me is probably very common for a lot of families. She kind of just shrugged and said, "Well, we didn't really talk about it." You know, we know a little bit, but it's not
Yeah.
something that we discussed at length.
Mm.
So she knew maybe a couple names here and there, but it wasn't. She didn't pull out a long tree or anything like that. Not at all.
Mhm.
But she said, but I have this one thing, and I think you'll find it really fascinating. And she went over to the bookcase and she pulled out a ticket stub.
Mm.
And it was a ticket for a boat ride, like a steamboat ride to America. And I remember looking at it and I was like, wow, this looks really old. And she said, yeah, she said, your great grandparents emigrated to Minnesota in the 1890s.
Wow.
And
Wow.
I just looked at her and I said, this can't be true. Like, what do you mean they emigrated? Because grandpa was born here in Sweden, and how does that make any sense? And she said,
Mhm.
yeah, I know that they sort of went over with that flood of immigrants that, emigrated from
Mhm.
Sweden and around that time. And they stayed there for about 10 years and then they moved back because they just didn't feel at home there. And so they actually moved
Right.
back from Sweden, or to Sweden,
Mm.
excuse me. And they moved back right before my grandfather was born. So his older sister was actually born in Duluth. And
Mm.
I just was extremely fascinated by the story because I'd never heard it before and nobody had ever mentioned that. And I just thought, well, that's a really great story. Why didn't anybody talk about this?
Yeah.
And so that's when I started researching and I found their immigration record, their passenger list coming into Ellis Island in New York.
Wow.
And I was hooked. I just kept researching, and it
Wow.
was just one
Yeah.
incredible story after the other, and there was no turning back. I was full on hooked completely.
That would have been a good class presentation.
It
Yeah.
was. I did get an A on that one. It was excellent. Yes. Yeah.
That's so good. So,
Mhm.
Caroline, can I ask? I know that there's a lot of look. Genealogy is a fascinating area, and I'm sure there
Yeah.
are so many different facets to it. And a lot of people listening to the podcast have come in around photos, and so obviously there's a lot of other areas regarding the genealogy. But can I just ask you specifically
Mhm.
with the role in photographs in genealogy? There's a number of different areas that I'm really fascinated to find out from you. Um, but can you just sort of explore when you're starting into genealogy? So if someone's maybe thinking about doing some research, or they maybe have an old photo or something like that, and they've got this interest as you do and you have, what role do photos play in a genealogy project, and how you've talked about that from a say the ticket stub of a boating ticket. When did you sort of start to then discover the rest of the genealogy sort of side of things from a photos point of view, and how does that play a role?
Right. So, I mean, I think photos are an excellent starting point for genealogy, right?
Mm.
A picture's worth a thousand words, right?
Yeah.
So I think if you have those old photos, those are an excellent way to start exploring, the story behind that photo. And what's happening, in that photo, who is the person, what is her story. I just think it's sort of a natural gateway to get
Mm-hmm.
into this,
Yeah.
because again, a lot of people have these old photos where they might not necessarily know who the person is, and I think that's always worth finding out. And so
Mm.
I'm always about telling the story behind the photo, and I feel like doing that in the best way possible is by combining everything. So, writing down the story with the context, descriptions, documents, photos, sort of as much as you can to make a complete story out of everything. I think putting all the pieces together really completes the whole thing, and photos obviously a huge part of it.
Yes, exactly, and I think that's a tangible sort of an insight into this past that they're exploring, and
Yeah.
it's true. There's so many questions, though. I think one photo raises so many questions. Where would you what sort of tip would you give someone if they're just starting out in this area, um, and just sort of as far as where to go, where to start,
Yeah.
what things to
Yeah.
consider, and something like that.
There's a lot you can do, right? And I think what keeps it from being overwhelming is that you start small and keeping your focus on one thing. I think with genealogy especially, it can snowball really quickly because, there's two stories with our parents, then there's four, then there's eight,
Mm,
and it
yep.
keeps snowballing, right?
Yeah.
And so I think it's really important to keep it very simple. And I always like to tell people to start with what you know, usually that's yourself, and you can write down your own story. That's a really great way to get started. Um, and then you can start with a photo that you have that you might like to research more about, or you can start with a person that you might like to know more about, and just keep asking one question after another. And something that I really recommend is just starting to write and just
Mm.
just opening a document and just writing down what you know. And I think a lot of things sort of reveal themselves at that point.
Mm,
Because let's say I write something like, here's a photo of my grandmother. Her name was so and so. She was born in, and then maybe you stop because you don't know where she was born.
Mm.
There's your first research question, right?
mm,
And so
Right.
then you go and you find that answer, and then you go on to the next sentence. And eventually you'll have a really good complete story about that one person. And so I think just
Okay.
keeping it simple and not getting
Mm.
overwhelmed with what program you need to use, or whether it's going to be paper research or digital research or stuff like that, it doesn't really matter as much
mhm.
as just sort of getting to the point of everything, right? The story
Yeah.
is what you want to tell. Yeah.
So, from a purely practical perspective, what you just said, does that mean like you would have like a simple Word document per
Hmm.
person, or do you have even have them all in one document, whatever? Is that what you're saying, sort of thing?
Yeah, I think that's a great way to
Yeah.
start. And if you want to
Okay.
just keep it simple. Yeah.
Mm.
Because what happens is I see a lot of clients come to me. I coach this obviously about genealogy organizing as well, and a lot of people come to me because they just have too many photos and documents in different places,
Mhm.
and they're just basically doing a lot of data entry into a program, but
Mhm.
then that information never really actually becomes anything, if that makes any sense,
Yeah,
right?
Mm,
makes a lot
They're
of
just
sense.
entering a lot of dates
Mhm.
and names and information, but then that's sort of where it stops because it just becomes too much, too overwhelming. And so I
Okay.
think just writing everything down in one place, if
Mhm.
that's just a simple Word document, that's a great place to keep it.
Mhm.
And it keeps you focused, right?
Yes, yes,
Instead
mm,
of
yes.
jumping between people and stories.
Yeah, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, talking about documenting and writing the stories and the information that we gather, and when you sort of marry that up with the photo, so we have one photo and then we can have a whole story to it. How do you sort of marry the two? Because you might have a photo library or a photo catalog somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
How do you like index them, or Do you do that at all?
Yeah, there's a lot of different ways that you can do that.
Right.
And so for me, it usually depends on, a couple of different things. One is the technology level of the,
Mhm.
the person I'm helping. That's a big one. And then there's different ways, depending, of course, on what programs people are using and all
Mhm.
that. I can tell you what I do, which
Mm.
is I have for my personal photo collection, I use Adobe Lightroom.
Mhm.
And I have that set up as basically referenced catalog,
Mhm.
right? And then I also use Family Tree Maker, and that program references the same files.
Right.
And
Okay.
so I keep one archive, and then all of the
Mhm.
programs that are connected to it sort of,
Mhm.
they look at the same files. And so I'm not doubling up anything,
Mm.
and I can look at them in the places I need them to be.
Is it possible to achieve that without using special software?
I think it is. Yeah, I think we always in photo organizing talk about, the digital photo hub
Mhm.
and keeping things consolidated as much as possible.
Mhm.
And I think you can do that regardless of what program you use, or even if you don't use a program at all.
Mm.
Um, I think it just depends on your tech level, how far you want to take it, and what you're trying to do. But
Mm.
even just keeping a simple structure on your computer and then maybe just a Word document, that's
Mm.
another great way to work with it. I think just making sure that you're focused and consolidated, I think is huge.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that, Caroline. I think that's so freeing, actually,
Mhm.
because you know, being in this area of organizing photos and really looking at people's levels of ability or interest, desire to use technology or not, or and there are so many options out there, and really you can get overwhelmed by just learning new software and things like that.
Right.
That's really a great idea. I like that people have the option, because really the interest that you have is in the stories and the people, and we can get caught up in those technical side of things to make that
Yeah.
Mm.
flow. But at least I think that's freeing, and I think that hopefully will help people that are listening to be able to say, okay, well, I can do that. I can open a Word document.
Yes. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Like, that's
Absolutely.
okay.
Yeah. And I
Yeah.
think you have to remember the point, right? Which is telling the stories. And how you get there is really irrelevant if you think about it, right? As
Yes.
Yeah.
long as it
Yeah.
gets told. So I think as long as you're comfortable with what you're doing and it works for you, that's okay with me.
Mhm.
Yeah. So just jumping to actually thinking about that, when you say having the stories be told, what sort of what do you see, or do you help to teach others as far as the actual end result? Do they end up with a book, or do they record this on a video type, a speaking?
Yeah.
Yeah. How does that
It
look?
can take yeah, it can take any number of forms. And again, it depends on a few different things, as you know, like, the timeline, the budget, all of that, the how much information we have. Oftentimes, when I research for others or when I help other people research for themselves, we start by creating a research report, meaning collecting all the information in one place and having it basically written down, kind of like a script if you were to
Mhm.
make
Hmm.
a movie, right?
Yeah.
And then we take that and then we can turn that into either, something that's recorded, whether that's audio, or we can turn it into a book. Um,
Hmm.
a, a lot of the time, this lends itself really well to books, right?
Mhm.
Yep.
Because you have the photos and the documents that you can show as
Yes.
well.
Yeah.
So that's something that we do quite often. But you can make pretty much anything you want. I think there's something really beautiful about recording stories in audio, like what we're
Hmm.
doing right now,
Yes.
Yeah.
because you can then hear them from the person who can
Yeah.
tell it, right? And even video, and you can there's
Yeah.
any number of things you're only limited by your creativity.
Mm. Yep. Yep.
So how I know that you can't probably put a number to that, but these projects they can drag out for quite a long time.
Yes, they can. Yeah.
Yeah, and it feel I'm not, as I said, I'm not an expert in that, and it's not a service I do offer. I have sort of, started a bit with my own family, and I can see like it's never finished because it grows, and there's another information. Oh, and there's suddenly another person popping up somewhere, and then you go and do that, and I find it's easy to get a bit scattered, and to have that feeling like this is not ever gonna finish.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what you're talking about is part of the worry, I guess, that people have when they come to me,
Mm,
because they worry about, well, how long is this going to take, and
yeah.
how, what is this going to cost, all of that stuff. But I think when I tell them that we need to focus, that's when they realize that, okay, we can do this, because
Mm,
it's true that if you don't set sort of a limit on your project, then it's just going to keep snowballing. It's going to keep going forever. And that's why it's so important to be focused. And so if you just start by telling the story of one person or one photo,
mhm,
that's something that's much more manageable
mhm.
than saying, like, oh, I'm going to tell the story of all my ancestors, right? Because
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
something will always come up again, and you won't be finished.
Yeah.
But you can say, oh, I'm going to tell the story of my great grandmother and great grandfather, and that could be one thing. Um, so there's limits that you can set on it, and you
Mm,
can also pick and choose. Like, if you've ever watched, the shows that are on TV, the genealogy shows, where
Mhm.
they follow somebody's journey,
Yeah.
yeah.
they're not telling the story of every single person in that family tree. They
Yeah,
pick and
that's right.
choose some of the more interesting stories, some of the more defining stories,
Mhm.
I guess you
Yeah.
could call them.
Mm,
They're not scrolling through hundreds or even thousands of names in that one
Mhm.
hour.
Mhm.
So I think you
yeah.
can pick and choose, and you can include lots of names, but you don't need to tell every single little bit of
Mm.
information. I
Right.
think I always think about it as if I'm creating some sort of program or show, I guess you could call it. Like, it
Mm,
needs to be consumable for
Yes.
the
Yes.
right for the audience.
Mm.
Otherwise, nobody's going to bother, and that's
right.
not the point, right? We need to
Yes.
make it
Yeah.
accessible, and
Yeah.
Mm.
right.
One of our golden rules is to know your why. It's our second golden rule is to why am I doing this?
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
What is the purpose of this project or organizing these photos or going into a genealogy research project? And I think that's great just to bring that same sort of clarity around what are you doing, and you're putting it from the perspective of the end result of sharing it in an enjoyable way,
Yes.
and touching on different parts of research. But yeah, so
Mm.
you mentioned coming up against or sort of discovering some different characters or some different interesting, fascinating stories. Can you share with us some of the craziest or funniest or saddest or
Abs-
just something fascinating? Yeah, that'd be interesting.
Absolutely, absolutely. And there are so many that it's really hard to pick,
I
I have to
bet.
say.
Yeah.
I've shared, in a couple of presentations I've done. I've shared quite a few stories, of my ancestors, but I think my favorite story personally
Yeah.
is one that I wrote about on my blog, which was my sixth great grandfather, who was a ship's minister in, Sweden, and he was on board a ship that actually foundered outside of Cadiz, Spain in 1758.
Whoa.
And he miraculously sort of survived this whole ordeal, and eventually he made it back home to Sweden again. His family had presumed that he was dead, but one day he just sort of showed up. And when he was a little older, he wrote a diary about his life
Oh,
Oh,
and
wow.
left that behind. And that's something that I found when I was a teenager on my quest for family history stories. And I have this diary, and it's one of the most fascinating things I've ever read
that's
in my life.
amazing.
He was very detailed. He wrote about Spain. He wrote about culture shock. He wrote about the story of survival. about never
Wow.
seeing his kids again, or at least he thought he was never going to see his kids again.
Mm.
He thought, he wrote about when he came back and what the reception was when he came back, and his life and his thoughts. And it was just incredibly detailed. And it just reminded me about how lucky I am to be alive,
Yeah.
to be
Oh,
honest. Because that
yes.
story could have ended very differently, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah.
At
And
any one of those
Wow.
points.
Yes,
exactly,
this is such a treasure to have. Oh my
it
That's
is.
gosh.
amazing,
And
Caroline.
It's,
I
Wow.
think that's
yeah.
the beautiful thing about family history, right? Is that you realize like how many different decisions people have made over
Yes.
these centuries
Mm,
that
Yeah.
resulted in you, right? And it's just an
Mm.
amazing, amazing miracle
Hmm.
that you're even here.
yeah.
Yes, it is.
Wow.
So
What a
you become
gift.
really grateful and humble when
Yeah.
you understand that.
Yeah.
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 Absolutely. So, just on a practical level, if you've got something like that sort of a diary or some precious photos or something like that that you've uncovered, how would you say is the best way that people could go about sharing them with their loved ones to try to either find out more information about
Yeah.
it, or just say you have come across a treasure like this and you want to share it with the information that you've got? Um, what's some sort of tools or ways that you have used before or that you use with your clients, that you could give to people listening that might be able to, share that with their loved ones?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think there's two parts to that answer. And I think the first one is is this a work in progress? In other words, am I just collecting information for putting some story together?
Yeah.
Or am I actually creating an archive here and sharing that, right? So if you are just sort of collaborating with people, and let's say you have a couple of cousins that you've recently come in touch with, you have stories to share, photos to share, it becomes more of a work in progress because you're just sort of trying to collect and share information back and
Right.
forth.
Hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Then something like a project management platform, you know,
Mm-hmm.
any of the ones that are out there, that can be really great just to sort of get the stories together and get them in one place, and make sure everybody has access to everything.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Um, I've even had luck with Facebook groups. I
Mm.
actually found a bunch of distant cousins. We made a Facebook group and we were sharing stuff with each other there just to sort of make sure that everybody knew the stories and could put them in their own, archives.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Um, but I also think that if you're trying to create something that's a little bit more permanent, then Facebook might not be the greatest place for that,
Mm.
right?
No.
So,
Mm-hmm.
um, you'd want to look for some sort of maybe cloud archive like SmugMug Forever, some service like that where you
Mm.
can actually create something more permanent and long lasting, um,
Mm.
and
Yeah.
share permanently.
That's the photos. How about I've come across quite a few family tree programs, and usually they're
Yeah,
cloud based. And I found I made the mistake once to try one, and then I realized you can't actually download or even print the stuff from it. So it's really in the
yeah,
cloud, and you can't. It's not yours. So
yeah.
how do you go about with that, and are there good programs where you can easily export information so that you can actually keep it under control and not just have it somewhere up there?
Yeah, right. So that is the challenge. And I think it's not so much the challenge of um, the fact that there's programs out there to do it. I think the challenge
Mm.
is not everybody's going to use the same type of computer,
Yeah.
the same type, have the same type of tech level. Those are more the challenges that you're going to come across, I think. But
Mm.
I personally really like Family Tree Maker
Mm-hmm.
because it does sync with Ancestry, and you can upload and download trees and sync the information that you're working on locally with your Ancestry account.
Mm.
And so that's one way that you can connect, many different computers to the same account, for example.
Mm.
So there are ways to do it. It's not necessarily the easiest thing for everybody to learn how to do, right?
Yes,
So
yes.
Mm.
that's something that I think you really have to consider is what's the easiest way to share this,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Right.
Depending on who you're you're working with, because
Yes.
what you want to make it easy for people to do it, otherwise they're just not going to do it, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So
Yep, exactly. And I think it's a great way to look at it. Either it's sort of in the project, it's in the collection stage, which is a very different
yeah,
mindset. It's a gathering information, which is
Yeah.
fabulous, and it's there's a lot more freedom and flexibility there, just back and forward. You're not feeling like, oh, I've got to capture every single thing that's being said.
right.
At the end of sort of the dialogue back and forward, then you gather the key points and put that into whoever really is doing the main sort of collection
Mm.
Yeah,
process, I guess, if that's what the goal is. And then the decision on what to actually post it to, either a Smug Mug or Forever, or and something like that, where it's a visual thing, or it's produced as a book or something like that. But
yeah.
um, yeah, that really makes that clear. I think it's I mean, not being having done any genealogy myself, I'm quite inspired. Thank you.
Totally.
I'm glad. Yeah.
Yes.
I'm going to start that Word document because I've got a lot of information, but I have actually attached it to photos in the descriptions with, the idea to eventually write it out a bit better. But I think it's time to start that Word document and collate it a bit in a different fashion. Because in thousands of photos, how are you going to find the information? Because it's not with every photo.
Yeah, and I think the great part about writing things out, it's helped my research process tremendously. Writing
Mm,
stuff out is just, you look at things differently and you see if it doesn't make sense. You see if
yes.
you've made a mistake more easily, and you can
Mm,
fill the gaps much more easily
Mm-hmm.
because you see it in context.
Mm-hmm.
Which, when you do that data entry and just putting information around out there, you don't connect it, right, in the
Mm-hmm.
same way.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think making something tangible, I know it's a digital document, so maybe that's the wrong word, but
yeah.
something like producing
Yes,
something
yes.
really
Yeah.
helps make
Mm-hmm.
it, sort of helps you put the finishing touches on it and connect it
Yeah.
into
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
one thing. Yeah.
So this is a bit of a techie question, Caroline, but just jumping back into your Lightroom um, managing of the photos, and then
Hmm.
sort of referencing that back in. If you have, just say, a photo of your grandparents, would you use certain, we've talked to our listeners about keywording and a few different things like that with metadata and stuff like that before, but
Hmm.
just as a bit of an overview, do you do the key information then as a separate keyword, like a metadata tag, say for the date of birth, their full name, on every
Yeah.
photo at every time, like their nickname, if that was, they were known as Uncle Ted or Teddy, or whatever it is. Like,
Yeah.
how do you then, like, what's your main captured information on each of the photos?
Right. And that's a project that can get pretty big, and admittedly I can get myself into a rabbit hole because I love this stuff. But I tend to approach all of this as um, a newspaper reporter. And that really helps me put the objectivity on it and say,
Mhm.
Mm.
so the headline or the title, what would be an appropriate headline for somebody who doesn't know the story? What would be the appropriate thing for me to put here? Same thing with names. What would be the appropriate name for me to put here? If somebody doesn't know this person,
Mm-hmm.
what do they need to know basically? And that's what I tend to put in. So I recently had a project where I was scanning these photos for this client, and I kept coming across this nickname, and I didn't realize until the end of the project that it was actually the same person. But they had written the nickname and the full name, and they were going back and forth. And because there there was different photos from different ages, I just never realized that it was the same person. And it wasn't until I was doing facial recognition and all that I put it together at the end of the
Right.
project.
Mm,
Yes. Yes.
And so I think I tend to go with maiden names for women, because
Yes.
mhm.
that's usually where the disconnect is a lot of the
Mm.
time historically. But then I put in married names as synonyms, for example. so that
Okay.
we can have that information as well. And then if I write something like Grandma Stella, right? Then I
Mm.
write a parenthesis maybe with her full name,
Mhm. Mhm.
to explain that. Or I have that information somewhere in the family history document that
Mm.
goes with the collection. So I try to explain it the best way I can,
Right.
assuming that whoever gets this is not going to know who these people are.
Yes, of
Mhm.
I hope that
course.
makes
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
So you
Yeah.
can't put all that usually in a file name. So do you put that in the caption field, or like, I know this is
Yeah.
really technical for our listeners, but
Right.
yeah.
No, that's okay. So I usually put the headline, the caption, the keywords. I have location tags on there,
Right.
and facial recognition if I can. But I also want to make sure that I have that information captured somewhere else, like in that family history book or report or whatever
Right.
it
Yeah.
might be, because
Yeah.
I can't guarantee that 100 years from now
Yeah.
somebody's going to be able to read that metadata right.
Yeah, that's correct.
Right?
Mm.
Yeah. Yeah.
We don't know how
Mm.
technology is going to evolve. We don't
Mm.
know,
The
so
end
I'm
user, and if they
trying.
can see. Yep. Yep. Yep.
Yeah,
Yep.
and
Mm.
depending on who you're dealing with, again, they may or may not know how to use these fields. And
Mhm.
so
Mhm.
I always feel like it's important to be as thorough as you can within the time that you have available, right?
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Talking
I
of
love.
time.
Yes, I know. We could talk for ages. We could talk for ages. Can you tell us, Caroline, about how, like, so you're obviously an expert in this area. What sort of, do you do some courses, or how could people find you or find out more about what you do and what you offer and stuff like that if they
Right.
were interested? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So you can find me at organizingphotos.net, and we have a blog with a very large archive right now. I'm proud to say we've been blogging for years, so there's a lot
Oh,
of fun stuff to
good.
read if you have nothing to do.
Oh,
um, we
people,
also,
Caroline's blog is really, really
It
something. You have
is.
to go there.
It
It's
is so
so good.
worth it.
Yeah.
Yep, it's so true.
yeah, thank you. We also have online courses that we offer both for professionals and the DIYers, in both fields actually, and we have more coming out in the near future as well. One will be interesting. It'll be on metadata for genealogists, so it'll
Oh,
be fun.
There you go.
fantastic.
Awesome.
Yeah,
Oh, I
so
love it.
there's a lot
That's great.
coming. Yeah, and we have a great
Mm,
community with lots of people
Mm.
to
that's
chat with.
great.
Yeah, so feel free
Yeah.
to check that out.
Well, and we'll put all the links and everything in the show notes for
Mm.
people too. So, well,
Wonderful.
thank you so much, Caroline, for being our guest today. It really has been a pleasure. We could have just kept on talking and
Yeah.
talking. We're getting in our little mind there, Chantal, about all the detail and but
We can always have you back.
we
Absolutely.
we can. But it was really interesting and inspiring, and yeah, just really great to just give us a bit of a window and an insight into this wonderful world of genealogy and photos with genealogy and stories. And thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
It was
Yeah,
really
so don't forget.
fascinating.
Yeah. So don't forget to check out Caroline's website on the show notes, and we'd love to hear from you. Please leave us a review, and as always, we welcome your feedback and questions, or just email us and contact us via social media channels. So I am Fiona from Photo Helper.
And I'm Chantal from Photos in Order. Thanks so much for being here today, and happy photo organizing.
Thank you. Thanks again, Caroline.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.